you, Jeremy, and thank you, audience. You have always heard the refrain that Rachel Reeves first made herself famous with: if we can't afford it, we can't do it. That is the exact opposite of the truth. What you need to do, you can afford, you can create the money. And that's the part where mainstream economics is completely wrong. And I want to explain why everything you want to do in the final session is feasible with government money creation, which is what should be happening. So, you've been through 50 years of this. As Jeremy says, it goes back to the mid-70s, actually dated even further back to 73 in Australia, as it happens. And there is something better than what they've done to us in the last 50 years, because what underlies austerity is a mistaken belief about money. It's a completely false set of theories. And I'm going to show in this presentation, it isn't just the government can run deficits. To have a well-functioning capitalist economy, the government must run deficits. Okay? The opposite of what you get told. And it should finance long-lived assets using that, not the private sector. And we can revitalise both the government and the private sector at the same time. There's not a clash between the two. In fact, both have been damaged by austerity. What we have lying behind what's happened for the last half century is mad, bad economics. And it's all based on the supply and demand thinking that I think is the most successful meme in the history of humanity. Those intersecting supply and demand curves have poisoned people's minds about how the economy operates. We simply have to throw that out. It is nonsense. It's as sensible as epicycles and equants were in astronomy before Galileo. That's what supply and demand curves are. I'm going to show instead you can use double entry bookkeeping. I never thought I'd say accounting is sexy, but you'll see why I use it immensely in this presentation. It's actually how the real world works. And if your model is inconsistent with double entry bookkeeping, it's a fallacy. And that's the case of mainstream economics. So they think in supply and demand curves terms because they've done a one-year course in economics and a PPE degree. And that's what they get taught in those degrees, is that government has to borrow the money. And it's all a fallacy, and I can prove that using double entry bookkeeping. So what's the foundation of the last 50 years of mistaken government policy is not understanding accounting. And that's why to take it on, you have to understand accounting yourselves. Now, what they get taught at university by conventional economists, obviously not by me, is that households lend out and government and firms borrow from households. And the Bank of England said that was false in 2014. And at that time, I thought there had to be a revolution in economics coming forward. And that isn't what happened. But the Bank of England said that the reality of how money is created differs from the description in some economic textbooks. Some means 99% of them, okay? There are a couple of heterodox textbooks out there. And they said rather than banks receiving deposits and lending them out, bank lending creates deposits. That's the paper. And this is how it's explained by one of the authors.
Economy, where does money come from?
Now, while this is nothing new, it is sometimes overlooked as the main way in which money is created. And it runs contrary to the view sometimes put forward that banks can only lend out deposits that they already have. In fact, loans create deposits, not the other way around.
Now, that's a revolutionary notion. It's going from flat Earth economics to understanding of the sun and not the Earth as the centre of the solar system. And you'd think economics textbooks would listen to the Bank of England, but they have not. They continue teaching the nonsense that the bank called out in 2014. And that's the foundation of the opposition that conventional economists and politicians and journalists have to deficit spending. So what they get taught is that deficits reduce the supply of money and crowd out private investment. And that's why you get the arguments that both supposedly progressive Labor and proudly conservative conservatives both say the government's got to balance the books. They learn this as impressionable youths at university, and they trust their professors. Normally that's a good idea, not in economics. Okay? And then they act upon those fallacies when they get into power. So this is the sort of thing they get taught.
Econ students, question, is it bad to save money? Let's find out by looking at the loanable funds market. Loanable funds are the amount of money that's available to be loaned out, and this is usually done by financial institutions like banks and credit unions. So the loanable funds market brings together borrowers, which make up the demand curve, and lenders, which make up the supply curve. The amount of money a bank can lend out depends on how much money people deposit into that bank. The supply of loanable funds is made up of private savings. That's savings by you and me, but there's also public savings. That's the money that the government has left over after paying for all its expenses. So the supply curve is made up of both private savings and public savings. And that brings us to the question that you're most likely to see on your exam. Show what happens on the loanable funds market when the government increases deficit spending. It's with a decrease in supply. Remember, there's private savings and public savings. If the government's doing a bunch of borrowing, that's going to decrease public savings. There's all this money to be loaned out, but the government comes in and starts to borrow it, so there's less money left over, and so the supply of loanable funds shifts to the left, and the real interest rate goes up. The point is, no matter how you draw it, when the government borrows, the real interest rate is going to increase, which causes crowding out. This is the idea that government deficit spending designed to help the economy actually ends up hurting the economy because it increases real interest rates and decreases investment and growth.
So that's why Tory and Labor both speak from the same gospel. They've been taught in the same church, and it's a fallacious church. Those assertions that government borrowing causes crowding out, decreases growth and so on are fallacies. And it's easy to show their fallacies using double entry bookkeeping, which I'll show you in a moment. In fact, deficits create money for the private sector and they encourage private investment. If you're wondering why it hasn't happened in the UK, austerity is part of the reason why. So why do economics textbooks teach fallacies? What on earth is going on there? Well, there's a long story behind it, but fundamentally, mainstream economics is delusional, anti-government and anti-worker. It's an ideology. You can't call it a science anymore by any stretch of imagination. So it blames unions and governments for problems that are caused by the finance sector. They're told that unions cause unemployment by getting above equilibrium wages, not the finance sector causes financial crises like the global financial crisis. They disparage inequality. Here's a lunatic mainstream economist saying that it doesn't matter to whom you give any money because it'll be spent in exactly the same way. So why worry about inequality? It is just simply delusional. I wrote an entire book on why. I'm going to start the third edition shortly. I have worked on an alternative. I'm not the only person who's done this. I've stood on the shoulders of genuine giants. Mainstream economists stand on the toes of pygmies, in my opinion. So they teach all these fallacies. And the main one, the most damaging, is about how banks work. So if you want to see how banks actually work, throw supply and demand curves out the window and do it in double entry bookkeeping format. So what I've done is I've taken what they're taught in textbooks and put it in double entry. And the argument is that savers lend to borrowers and banks are just conduits for that lending to occur. So a saver lends £10, so saver's account goes down by £10. The borrowers go up by £10. There's still just £100 in existence, no money has been created, and that's the basis of what they're told about the functioning of banks. Now, in the real world, banks lending creates deposits, as the Bank of England said. So you simply put say the loan is actually an asset of the bank now, the loan goes up by £10, the deposit account goes up by £10, £10 is being created as a result of that, and also £10 worth of debt. That's the real world. Now, what's the impact? Now, Nick, you're going to love, we'll not believe this is published in a journal. Sorry? Sorry? Oh, sorry, I'm thinking about my half-hour time limit, but okay. So they teach, they believe that it doesn't matter if you teach a fallacy. And here's how these economists put it. I have a benchmark result for the relationship between the two models, and they show that both yield the same allocations when there is no uncertainty. And then say, in such a situation, using the simpler model does not imply any loss of generality. I mean, these are lunatics. Okay? This is just facepalm nonsense that lies behind mainstream economics. It really is flat earth economics. That's what's been dominating us for the last half century. It's completely wrong about the creation of money, and the real world's always uncertain. Try to find somewhere where uncertainty doesn't apply. I'll wait, okay? So I can take that myth that banks are intermediaries and I can convert it in my Ravel software to the real world. So there I have the model that get taught in the textbooks, and you have increasing amount of credit, nothing happens to GDP. Reducing amount of credit, nothing happens to GDP. You can ignore credit. That's the argument they get taught in the macroeconomics. But it's not true that households lend to governments or firms. It's the banks that lend. So I can delete the debt as being shown as an asset of the savers and make it shown as an asset of the bank. That's all I do there. And then I hit run again. And now run the model. Now we have credit. GDP rises. Okay? Credit goes negative, GDP falls. Credit is absolutely critical to how the economy functions. And these idiots leave it out completely on the basis of simply stupid assumptions. So if they're that wrong about government debt, okay, I call the real world money BORMD, by the way, stands for Bank Originated Money and Debt. I think it's a useful acronym. So if they're that wrong about private debt, what are they like about government debt? Now, it's slightly more complicated to show it, but this is now showing what they think happens, and that is they imagine that the government sells bonds directly to households, and that therefore would mean that households are left money to lend to firms, and so you're going to have crowding out occurring because of that function. Now you rearrange it and say the banks are the original buyers of that debt, and the deficit itself creates money, and so does interest payments. They both create money. They're not borrowing money, they're creating it. There's a slight difference between the two. Okay? So the primary bond sales change the asset that banks the money, but it doesn't access money at all. There's no doubt that those options are going to be fulfilled. So deficits crowd in private investment because there's more cash flow. And with more cash flow, you can have more investment out of turnover. You don't have to borrow the money in the first place. So they tell us there's going to be a catastrophe. And in their model, this is again putting their model into double entry bookkeeping form, everything's fine so long as the government doesn't run a deficit. But as soon as it does, you can see what's happening to debt down the bottom there. It goes exponential. Nothing happens to the money supply because in their model there's no money created by the banking system. And you end up with a government debt ratio from simply a 1% of GDP deficit, which is tiny. You end up with 2,000% government debt to GDP ratio, obviously a catastrophe, can't allow that to happen. That's what lies behind Reeves's thinking. But again, it's not true that the households are doing the lending. And I can rapidly say it's the banks who buy the bonds, not the households, so get rid of the household entries there. It's not true that the government banks at the private banks, it banks at the central bank, so I can delete that, come down here and say, as well as having reserves as a liability, the Reserve Bank has the government's account as a liability, then show the transfers happen at the central bank between the government's account and the reserve accounts of the banks. Put those entries in. Hit a switch to show it's actually the banks are receiving the interest now. And now run the same model. And what happens? Nothing if the government does nothing. When the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, it creates money. That leads to a rising GDP. And rather than the debt level becoming infinite, it stabilises. It tapers in this particular case to 100% of GDP. I could show you how to make it 50%, but that's another story. Okay? So there's no reason to panic in the real world. This is all people being afraid of the dark, not knowing what's actually going on. So in the real world, government deficits create fiat money, and that finances public services and enables economic growth as well, and debt levels stabilise. The thing they're scaring us with in the Financial Times is garbage. It's not how the banking system actually operates. There is no government debt crisis. Now, mainstream economists have everything backwards. They blame government debt, but if you look at the data, it's private debt that's dangerous. This is American data. You can see which one is bigger. Private debt is much larger. Credit, which is the change in private debt, that's what causes booms and busts. That's the correlation of credit, the annual change in private debt, to the unemployment rate. And deficits come in and they attenuate the damage done by private debt bubbles. So they don't cause the unemployment, they reduce the amount we experience, which is why we haven't had a Great Depression. And it's a global phenomenon. This is the UK data and Spain, the same sort of pattern, not as obvious as the American case in the UK's position. It is actually for Spain. But this is a rule around the world. Private debt is bigger than government debt. Private debt causes the bubbles and the busts. That's what we should be controlling, not government debt. They've got it all, to use an Australian expression, they've got it arse about tit. So it's not fit for purpose. There's no way you could win the election and continue using the same economics. You'd end up destroying your credibility. You've got to change the economics completely. Now, they say deficits reduce the supply of money and crowd out. The reality is they increase the money supply and encourage private investment. So the state should run deficits to finance the long-term assets the private sector won't build or runs down. Public health, as we know, public education, All the things that the privatisation has destroyed, that's why you can't go swimming in Britain's rivers anymore. Okay, they don't bother doing the maintenance, reduces profitability. So the error actually comes out of the whole theory of banking. And remember that guy said the supply curve consists of both public and private savings. The sum of public and private savings is zero. Not positive, it's zero. And you can see this by realising that somebody's financial asset is a claim on somebody else, a liability is somebody else's claim on you. The sum of the two is zero. So fundamentally, what you have is a seesaw. If we start off balanced, we can't actually start off balanced because banks are required to have short-term assets that exceed their short-term liabilities. So banks are up there. And that means the non-bank sector, and that includes the government as well as us, is down here in negative financial equity. So if we just leave it with the private sector in that sense, we're going to be in negative financial equity and nobody enjoys having debts that exceed their assets. But if the government goes into negative equity, so the government's down here, then it's possible for both the banks and the non-bank public to be in positive equity. And a government without debt actually forces the private sector into negative equity. Banks have to be up there, otherwise they don't work. If the government stays here, then the households and firms are down here in negative equity. The only way that you can get households and firms being positive short-term equity is if the government swaps places with them. Then you can have positive net worth for the non-government sector, and that leads to much more stability like we saw in the 50s and 60s and the chaos ever since the 70s. So conventional economic advice is completely back to front. Government surpluses drive the private sector into negative equity, and that encourages them to speculate and gamble on share prices and on property. And when you take a look at what happened over the very long term, this is using American data, which is more detailed than the UK, there is a 10-year period where the American president ran a 1% of GDP surplus in the 1920s. There's the Great Depression. There's not a coincidence that one followed the other. Equally, Clinton was proud of his surpluses. We had the global financial crisis shortly afterwards. The government running a surplus causes financial crises. It doesn't avoid them, it causes them. Now, nobody likes being in negative equity, and obviously that includes politicians, but the government is the only institution that can afford to do it, and one of the reasons is non-financial assets. Those are things which are assets to the owner and a liability to no one. That includes the bureaucracy and the legal system, the military and police, they're not doing too good a job at the moment. Hospitals, schools, public infrastructure, all that stuff supports what the government does. And the government actually needs to have liabilities with the rest of the world because partly that's how you define your country. Where your government's liabilities are accepted as money is where your country exists. So being a negative equity is a sensible thing. And government funds and government bonds aren't our liability, they're our asset. The bonds are owned by the private sector when they're sold. The money's held in our pockets. They're not our liabilities, they're our assets. So it's time the many took control from the few, and to do that you have to understand money creation, which is why I'm labouring this point so much here. Now, when you look at all the objections you get, they're all a fallacy in the real world. So one of the many is, what about bond vigilantes? Okay? These people are supposed to say, no, we're not going to accept the government's bonds anymore, we're going to refuse to buy them. Well, that doesn't happen in primary auctions. When those primary auctions are held, if you have an account at the Reserve, at the Central Bank, it's Bank of England, then you can bid. Of course, nobody in this room does. Okay? It's the banks who do. What they're doing is they're swapping reserves, which they can't trade and used to not earn them any money, into stuff they can trade, which does earn them money. And there are auctions roughly every 2 or 3 days. Now, if you look at the scale of the government deficit, it's never been, for decades, more than 10% of GDP. That means, on average, at each of these auctions, about 0.1% of GDP worth of bonds is traded. Now, the reserves that exist after the global financial crisis are equivalent to 30% of GDP. That means there's 300 times the funds that are necessary to buy the bonds that are on auction, offer at each auction. Okay? They will never be, they're always oversubscribed. There'll never be a failure to sell bonds at a primary auction. It's simply a myth. Okay? And the crisis we had with trusts was because putting up interest rates devalued existing bonds and put a large number of pension funds into financial jeopardy. So the inflation fighting efforts of the central bank, based on neoclassical economic theory, caused the crisis. Okay? It wasn't trust so much. Hughes had the bad luck of being Prime Minister at the time, but it didn't last long, fortunately. Okay, what about interest payments on debt crippling us? Again, the government creates the money. It doesn't borrow it. It could give too much to the finance sector, and it definitely does do that right now, but it can't go bankrupt in its own currency. So the government is not like a household. You'll see this analogy all the time. Government's like a household. No, it's not. Unless your spouse could buy all your outstanding debt and therefore cancel your need to pay interest. So can your spouse do that? Oh, gee, no. Okay. So you're not like a central bank. Okay? The central bank could buy all outstanding bonds today. Could buy the whole damn lot. Okay? And that would cancel the need to pay interest completely. Now, who would complain if that were done? I guarantee you it'd be the banks, okay? Because they actually want the bonds. They don't need our money, but we don't need their money, they need ours. They'd be the first ones to complain about the government not issuing bonds anymore. The world is upside down. Okay? What about inflation? We've heard Milton Friedman say that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Have you heard of helicopter money? This is the article in which Milton Friedman first put that forward. And he assumed a stationary society with a constant population, given taste, fixed volume of resources, given state of the arts, capital goods you can't sell or create, okay? No money, no borrowing allowed. You couldn't even sell goods, you can only sell services. And there's pieces of paper floating around, and you've been in this situation for an infinite period of time, so you're in equilibrium, and then a helicopter flies over the top and drops another 1,000 notes. Well, yeah, that'll cause inflation because there's nothing else left to cause inflation. It's a mythical world. In the real world, we have changing population, changing tastes, changing everything. And of course, lending exists and the economy's in disequilibrium. So their starting point is a myth, and it drags you into thinking in terms of a myth. And when you look at the data, it's not the banks so much that control the creation of money, it's the bank contracts we've signed with credit cards. The amount of spare room in credit cards in America right now, if everybody accessed those credit cards, could create $5 trillion worth of additional money. And the banks couldn't stop you doing it. So the causation doesn't go from government money printing to inflation, it goes the other way around. Okay? The primary causes of inflation are social conflict over the distribution of income, technological progress which reduces inflation, and rising energy costs which increase it. Those are the basic causes. And when you look at the amount of money created by the government, as it happens, because both the private sector and the government create the money, most of the money created in the last 40 years has been created by the private sector. 91% of the money created since 2000 in America is privately created money. And you may not be amazed to know that during 1980 to 2000, government policy actually destroyed money. 144% of it was created by the private sector, therefore the public sector was actually cancelling money. Now, how on earth could government policy cause inflation if government was destroying money across that period of time, not creating it? All the stuff you're taught is back to front. And the global experts are those two people on inflation. So if you want to get sensible people advising you, get rid of the Bank of England's research staff and get Isabella and Blair in control. Now, we've been dominated by the belief that you have to slash spending since even before Friedman and Thatcher. It's been something that's been part of people's thinking for centuries. But if you look at the level of government spending, the American average over the last 125 years is it's run a deficit of 2.8% of GDP. Looking just at the post-war period, it's 2.6% of GDP. Now China, and thank God we have an alternative example to look at these days, China has used fiat money creation, which is what a deficit does, to build their economy. They've run a deficit twice the scale of what America has run for that period of time. And when you look at where inflation comes from, it's government deficits where money comes from. Government deficits create money, private sector credit creates money, and a trade surplus creates money. Put those three together, and China's harnessed all of them and used it wisely for an incredible level of development. And if you look at the rate of economic growth, that means China's per capita income has grown by more than 9% per year over the last 40 years. The UK's has been 1.5%. Now, what that means is the UK would take 45 years to double per capita incomes China is doubling them every 7.5 years. If that kept on going for another 45 years, the UK would double its per capita income by 2070. China would be 64 times richer. Okay? China's doing the right thing, not the UK, not America. And its industrialisation has been radical. That's a photograph I took in Sichuan in 1981-82. There's actually alligator skins being sold in the back there. Now it's a high-tech powerhouse. You have to see it to believe it. I literally saw it in this state 1 or 2 years later. The big buildings were Russian and French. On one side of the border, there was nothing on the other, virtually nothing. That's it now. So China's got the public-private divide right. The public sector provides the infrastructure and the socially beneficial facilities that the private sector won't provide because they can't make a return in time. It's not worth their while waiting that long to get a return when they've got to pay interest costs or pay dividends. So the public sector creates that. The private sector is highly competitive in areas where innovation and new technologies matter dramatically. And one of my colleagues, Avner Off, has done a great book on the divide between what should the public spend on and what should the private sector spend on. So that's the real world. That's the world you're in. You are finally, it's a turning point. I hope this is a turning point to get away from garbage economics, telling us we can't do what we should do. In fact, what we must do. So when you look at what happens without a government, according to the neoclassicals, things are better. When you model it using the technology I've developed here, mathematicians said that leads to a crisis. A debt deflation will happen without government spending. When you have government spending, you can avoid the catastrophe that occurred during the Great Depression. Without it, you just go down the plug hole. So there's strong mathematical foundations for the ideas that I'm showing you here. It's not just verbal logic. It's solid, empirically validated information. So we need better tools. And system dynamics, which is the area that engineers tried to bring into economics 50 years ago and got pushed away by the economists, those tools now exist. They're sophisticated enough to manage a national economy. And you can't manage the economy using the same tools that gave you the stupidity of austerity and the decades of stagnation that came with it. You need new tools and new theories, and they already exist. So throw the neoclassical textbook away and find people like myself. There's quite a few colleagues that I have who want to overthrow this nonsense. We've been trying to do it for the last 50 years without success. You can find my work in those two sites, and there are those alternative tools which support progressive politics. You will have to use them to be able to survive and succeed as a government. And my software is called Minsky, or Ravel, and that's what I've been using in the presentation so far. My most recent book talks like an engineer to Elon Musk, and it tells him to leave the economy alone and stick to blowing up rockets. Now that's you can get a bit of a detail on my approach there. I'm giving an online course these days as well, so this is a bit of advertising here, but it's advertising because you need it. You need the right tools, you need the right advisors to be able to succeed in what you're trying to do. You can't defeat the Tories without changing to that sort of politics. You can improve both the economy and the lives of the many at the same time. And you need a realistic approach, and that exists. And please, when you see this on the YouTube, share it. We've got to get rid of that meme of supply and demand curves. Thank you.
Steve, thank you very, very much for that. Absolutely brilliant. And I loved the headline there, why do Labour and Tories have the same economic policy? Absolutely perfect question. Well, we've got 10 minutes, or 9 minutes actually, for questions to Steve. So I'll take 3. If there is, I've been asked to make sure there is one about NHS cuts and the creation of that environment which enables them as well. But if nobody asks that, I'll ask it. Yeah, up there. I'll take 3, then we'll get Steve to reply. So we finish on.
It's bad hearing too, so speak loudly.
Hi. Yes, Gary Howkins. In the creation of money, it's the Bank of England that actually does that.
No.
No?
No.
Okay.
The Treasury does it.
Well, this is my question.
Through the avenue with the central bank, but the Treasury creates the money.
So, but this is my question. Where does the real power in creating that money actually lie? And I asked that question because we're thinking about the Liz Truss administration. 6 weeks that government actually lasted, and it was a standoff between the governor of the Bank of England and a politician, an elected politician. You know, no matter how bad you think she is, which she was, but. You know, where does this because personally I think that the real power has actually been handed over to the Bank of England.
Hold that one for a second, Steve. We'll take a couple of others. I think there is a point about Gordon Brown making the Bank of England independent in 1997 was part of it as well. Yes, up there. And was there somebody else? And then those two here, then we must move on quickly, yeah? Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Found that very, very interesting. Look forward to reading your book. I had always understood that a barrier to kind of radical economic change in terms of higher spending is the potential reaction of international credit rating agencies in terms of downgrading our credit rating, which raises the cost of government borrowing and other things. So do you see that as a risk when recommending pursuing these policies? And if so, how would you mitigate it?
Okay.
There was a hand over there. Yes, that hand there. And then, yes, the one there. Yeah. Sorry, Ruth, and then one over there. Is that all right? Are you feeling very fit this morning?
So working in the civil service, but speaking very from a personal level, when we get told to make cuts, to make savings, how do we talk about the cost of making cuts today and how that would create deficits in the future in a way that's persuasive within the civil service that you can push back on gently and, you know, with respect for politicians, but in a way that speaks this language accessibly for political leaders?
Thanks. Last question over here, then Steve to reply, because we must finish by 1:45. That gives Steve 7 minutes to reply at the most. No, 6. Sorry, Ruth.
No, I love us. Oh, no, I must.
Yeah.
Oh, well, if they're really quick questions, we'll take your own you, yes. Be quick, please, both of you.
No. Hello, can you hear me? Yes, I wonder, it's I love your talk about infrastructure, the need to invest in infrastructure. How has the story got out there? And we need to increase economic understanding, but billionaires, what about their economic understanding? Is there an acknowledgement that they need that infrastructure in order to build their fortunes?
So it's money for rockets, yeah?
I can ask after. Project. Oh.
Okay, lovely. All right. Steve.
Okay. Well, okay. In terms of where the power lies with the Treasury and the Parliament. Okay? And the central bank is owned by the Treasury, fundamentally. I'm not sure the situation for the UK. I've read too many central bank documents, but central banks either remit all their interest earnings back to the Treasury, or if they own bonds, then the Treasury doesn't pay interest on them. So the power lies with the Treasury, and once Parliament has passed an act, then the act requires the Treasury to do an appropriations. There's a lot of complicated mechanical movements, what are called open market operations, and so on, to make sure there's enough reserves at different times. It's a complicated process. Okay, but the fundamental thing is once the government has said we want to spend this money, the Treasury then designs the transactions that are involved, the bonds are sold, and there's so many bonds, as you saw, that out there, if there's not enough reserves available, then the central bank buys the bonds to make the reserves available. There's no possibility of the primary auction being unfulfilled. What goes wrong is banks then sell those bonds to the private sector, mainly other financial institutions, but also rich individuals. And then when the interest rates go up, that devalues bonds. So a lot of pension funds bought bonds when interest rate was 1%. Interest rate goes to 5%. The value of the bonds they hold plunges. And fundamentally, we came very close to destroying the financial sector by increasing interest rates from 1% to 5%. And the only reason the financial sector didn't collapse is they have this fiction they call hold to maturity. So they have some bonds they mark to market, so the bond values changes with what happens in interest rates. But they pretend that most of them are going to be held till maturity, and therefore they keep a constant value. They don't write the asset value down. If that wasn't done, it wouldn't just be a few pension funds who collapsed because of rising interest rates. Could have been the whole banking system. And again, neoclassical economists are just unaware of those sorts of dangers. So the Treasury, the government is controlled, the Treasury owns the central bank. We've given far too much power to neoclassical economists because they're the ones who run the central banks, and according to their theories, the central bank is the control mechanism. They're completely wrong about that as well, but the power lies with the government and then the Treasury, in that sense. I sort of missed with the third question, the credit rating question. That is a danger. Credit ratings are dominated by the same people who believe the government has to borrow money. The same economic thinking goes through. They probably will downgrade your debt. That might have an impact on the value of the pound. So that is a danger. But it's an irrational reaction to what you're doing. If I had to say one area I'd like to see progressive parties focus upon, you have to reduce your trade deficit. And one way to do that is to promote food production, because the UK imports more than 40% of its food. And I would not like to be here if there's a global famine, which I think global warming is going to give you. So an easy way that doesn't involve having to outdo China in technological powers is to get food production up in the UK. And you can learn from the Netherlands on how to do that too, which makes it rather easier. Billionaires, if you see the stuff that that Musk spews out, they live in their own little bubble, and the bubble is sitting on top of the mainstream economics they've absorbed, however they learned it. He did actually do an economics degree at Wharton, I think, the same place that Trump supposedly learned economics. So they're all living in a mythical world. They're telling you these things are going to happen, but in fact they're dependent upon government spending for the scale of their profits. And the sensible people on this is a Polish economist called Michał Kolewski, wrote in the 1940s and 50s and 30s. And he proved that the government deficit actually turns up as part of the profits of the private sector. So they're shooting themselves in the foot. I think we should let them.
Steve, thank you very, very much, and that's absolutely a brilliant way to end. So, Steve, is it okay if we put your papers up on the PJP website?
I'd be massively offended if you didn't.
So we will put them up because we don't wish to cause you any offence whatsoever, and we can use those as a tool for further debate and discussion. But thank you very, very much indeed, Steve. That's absolutely brilliant. And we're now absolutely on time for me to hand over for the next session, which is on health and social care. Who's chairing the next session? Claudia? Alia.
Yeah.
Who?
I think Alia.
Okay, Alia.
Okay, put this out. Let's see. All right, I'll take this away. Okay. I've got to grab all my bits and pieces here, so give me a second to do that. Okay, that's it there.